So while people are making their way in, I'm just going to make my usual announcements at the beginning of the webinar, and that is welcome to the RIPPT seminars for 2022. And if this is your first webinar, welcome. We have been doing this for over a year, since January of 2021. And in 2022, we decided to use this webinar, this theme called How Research Informs Practice and Practice Informs Research. And if you're not familiar with RIPPT, we're the Research Intensive Programs in Physical Therapy, and we're a consortium of ACAPT. And I just want to point out that we have some exciting speakers coming up in March and April already scheduled. And we're going to be focusing on the next two talks on wearable sensors. So on March 22nd, we have Ignacio Alejandro Guinard coming by way of University of Miami. And he's going to focus on using wearable sensors for motion analysis. And then we have Rich Sousa coming from the West Coast, and he's going to focus more on activity monitoring. And if you're not aware, we have all of these webinars are recorded, and this one is being recorded tonight. And you can go to our RIPPT Consortium web pages and see any of our past webinars and watch them again or watch them for the first time. So I'm Debbie Givens. I am the leader of the group that puts these webinars together and the past chair of the RIPPT Consortium. And so welcome tonight. And I'm going to stop sharing and let Carole Tucker take over from this point.
Hey guys, so welcome. It's hopefully everybody had a lovely Tuesday, because as we all know by now, it's 02/22/2022. And in addition to that, it is National Margarita Day. So for those of you here in the evenings, I hope some of you guys are enjoying it at least. So I am Carole Tucker. I am a member, I represent University of Texas Medical Branch in RIPPT. I am the Associate Dean for Research. I'm a practicing physical therapist. I still see patients clinically, and I do run my own research program. So this topic of clinical research networks connecting research and practice and research really resonates with me, both as the clinician partner as well as the research partner. Next slide. We have no disclosures. Next slide. We'll move fast through these. I am going to talk, you can read through the learning objectives, but basically we tried to approach this webinar not just as a transactional, here are the things that you need to do, but really trying to frame this concept of learning health networks or clinical research networks from both a higher level as well as a pragmatic level. So I'm going to start a little bit at the micro level, kind of from the perspective of how what we do in the clinic impacts these large research networks, and how we as program directors, be it both of DPTs or PhD programs, may need to start thinking about facilitating this as a strength within PT research. So Nik, next slide, please. We opted to share one slide. Nik and I are both really willing to answer questions. We have a lot of slides that we'd like to get through. So if there is a question you have, put it in the chat. We're having the chat monitored. We may wait to kind of group those questions till the end just so we can get through. So the last webinar we did was presented by Christine McDonough at the University of Pittsburgh, who is within the Learn M3R network. And she presented the definition of a learning health system. And essentially, it's this interactive resource that kind of pulls the science, informatics, incentives, and rolls them around. So Nik, I'm going to have you go to the next slide, because people can read some of these while I'm doing it. So when we think about a learning health system, you can think about the key functions, which if you start anywhere, I typically start a little bit down in the green box, you're capturing actions. You're going to then assemble that data, those actions being in the clinic, analyze the data, so transforming some of that performance in the green box, the clinical experiences into data, analyze it, data to knowledge, interpret the results, knowledge to performance or knowledge to generalizable wisdom, and then that feeds back in. So learning health systems are key aspects of both research efforts as well as I'll think of the word quality improvement programs. And they've really been, Christine's, Dr. McDonald, when she talked last month, really focused a lot on the QI aspects of it, which is really powerful. When we think of learning health systems, and Nik is going to address this a little bit more when he talks about PCORI more specifically, I could spin up these loops every time I have a clinical area of practice that I want to gain knowledge on. So maybe I need a learning health system at my institute for multiple sclerosis, and maybe one for premature infants, and maybe one for minority health. But that's not very efficient. And so PCORI, as well as other agencies, really provide that infrastructure where we can do this clinical to practice and practice to research loop without starting and kind of rebuilding everything. So next slide. And by the way, actually, Nik, if you can go back, I want to recognize these two slides are from work of Dr. Friedman, who's the chair of the Learning Health Sciences at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. So in many ways, he has really built out a lot of the concepts we have about the pedagogy of learning health sciences. So I encourage you to go to that website and look at it if you kind of want more grounding in the topic. All right, next slide. As I mentioned, I'm going to actually specifically be addressing, I actually think I should have flipped these practice to research, where I'm going to try to have Nik talk a little bit more about research to practice. So next slide. So when we think about implementation science, and again, you can see this loop that I briefly presented before, and where I have the two red arrows, so more on that clinical side, so moving from that performance up into generating knowledge from that. I'm going to address the need to represent health information as computable data and to share and analyze data into new knowledge. So just again, a little bit of a framework for people to start thinking about this practice to research, research to practice loop. Next. All right. So one of the things that strike me about clinical research networks and things that are derived from the EHR is we did this move from paper records into electronic health records. I don't know, I can't see hands, but I'm sure many of you that are of my generation remember those incredible paper records. And unfortunately, I don't think anybody had an idea that we would have cell phones back then. We still had beepers and landlines. And as we started to convert into electronic records, what people really did was just basically take the sheets and stack forms in these electronic records. So any of us in a healthcare system that are like, wow, I really like to see all the patients that had a sternotomy, that got an infection, that were seen by physical therapy, basically have to kind of have a list on the side where then you can identify those medical record numbers and go through and pull them. So this concept of moving from a paper record where we have different forms into an electronic health record hasn't done much to help modernize our ability to take EHR data out and to use it to generate knowledge. So that's a caveat. I'm hoping that they'll come along sooner and sooner. But next slide, Nik. So I want to talk a little bit about how we're going to represent health information as computable data. And as everybody is sitting there thinking, why do I, as a physical therapist or an occupational therapist, need to be thinking about this? Isn't this the job of someone else that does informatics? But in order for us to both use that knowledge that is then extracted, as well as the impact that we have on the knowledge that goes in, we need to think about the data in our clinical records as computable data. So if we take the electronic health record, which again is symbolized by that graphic on the left, And whether it's Epic or a NetHealth or any of the major Cerner medical records, we need to basically take a Rosetta Stone and have them all talk the same language. And that's where you'll see things come up that are called common data models. And I'm presenting this here. I'm giving you little teases because we're fitting a lot of information in. But if you go to the Observational Medical Outcomes website, you can Google that, or if you go to the FHIR website, these are two data models that are geared towards coding medical information, all within the same categories and the database types and all of that. So this is something that I never learned about in PT school or as a PhD student within my program. And as I pointed out, this continues to evolve, but I think as physical therapists, as rehabilitation researchers, we need to have a better understanding of our resources and how these things are coded. If you don't understand how these things are coded, if you're still thinking about them as being kind of that electronic paper medical record, it's going to be a lot harder for you to actually query that data and to turn that data into knowledge. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about what is one of the hardest things for me to think about and to convince the informatics and the people that are doing the AI or the machine learning on the data that they're extracting from medical records. And that's the clinical documentation practices. So I think most of us on this call have probably documented in an electronic health record, probably paper for some of us. And when we extract that data later in these large networks, the data quality, what we're actually seeing is what the therapist documented or what the physician documented or what the lab tests are in there. And some of the ways that we document just because we're busy and we're thinking about it aren't providing accurate, if you want to think about it, computable data. So one of the things therapists do is often bundle when they do their documentation. They may see 5 patients in the ICU and then go and sit in front of a computer and document their findings. They may see somebody in a clinic and at the end of the day, end up doing their documentation. And when we do that, sometimes it turns into a task versus an incredibly thoughtful, I am going to document every, nuanced aspect of physical therapy and of my intervention. And so I think within programs or within PhDs or as consumers of this knowledge, we need to be aware of the fact that sometimes the physical therapist may document at 4 o'clock, the treatment could have been at 11. So if you're trying to look at a question that's the timing of physical therapy interventions, that may not be accurately represented. The level of detail can always make a difference. So how many of us prefer to write our own long note qualitatively and not use any of the Epic forms? Or if I do a tug and I have to go and there's an electronic form for the tug, I have to navigate over that. But those little shortcuts we take, and they may be for quality. I may feel that I can better write what I saw in that patient than what maybe some worksheet developed by a PT 3 doors down or 3 buildings over did with either Epic or that. So one of the things I would encourage for the level of detail is to really think about using some of those forms that are going to make those data discrete and able to be pulled out. The reason for this, and I want to be really clear, people are using the data we're documenting. You guys realize that we can go back to 2006 and extract everything that was ever documented within a healthcare system if it's in the electronic health record. So that means that every time you document about your physical therapy practice, if you're not putting it in places, if you're waiting to document, and I'll talk about the purpose of documentation and where it is, then what's going to happen is people are going to be looking to decide if physical therapy is effective, pull all of the electronic health record in a health system, And if we haven't done our job of documenting accurately, then it's going to be hard to infer the benefit of the practices that we do. So again, a little bit of a soapbox there. We also worked with clinicians and asked them about their documentation practice. So we did a qualitative study, and one of the wisest, orthopedic surgeon, we have to balance that a little bit, but one of the wisest orthopedic surgeons actually said that when we asked him, what does he think about when he starts to document it, what he does, paraphrasing a bit, but he said, well, what do you mean? It depends on if I'm documenting for clinical care or if I'm documenting for insurance because something bad happened to the patient, or if I'm documenting for research purposes. So for him, the type and the detail and the quality and where he would document it depended on what he was thinking that purpose of. So this is the opportunity for us, I think, as program directors to start including within some of our curriculum, or maybe advocate to CAPD, that we need to understand that the quality of the documentation goes beyond a SOAP note. It means using forms. It means working with IT to make sure that we have the right flow sheets. To try not to put everything in clinical or qualitative documents. Nik, you can go to my next slide. Oh, wait, actually, I do want to talk about this figure, but to really be thoughtful, and I think we as a profession need to do it. So this is a manuscript. It's a publication of Dr. Koscielniak's. And one of the things he looked at was the data quality and the completeness. And I'm not going to do this justice, but you can go pull the paper up. Of how often things were documented. And I know this is going to be a shock to people, but when we have separate forms for muscle strength and one for range of motion and maybe one for tone and maybe one for functional assessments, things that are documented on a single worksheet tend to be more complete or more interrelated than those on other ones. So if we could have a condition-specific flow sheet, maybe, where we document all of those on one, instead of somebody going to the manual muscle test form and somebody going to the range of motion or someone going to another form. It's an example of how maybe we could continue to get completeness of documentation. I don't know if that makes sense. The other thing we also found is that physicians oftentimes won't go into the physical therapy records to look at some of those things specifically. So are we providing them too much information for them to be actionable even clinically or for research purposes? So again, this is how clinic or how practice informs research, if that makes sense. All right, next slide. So some recommendations that come out of this is, as practitioners, we should document completely. We should be thinking that our data will be repurposed for researcher quality improvement. If we as PTs aren't accurately documenting what we are doing, it's hard to see what's effective. If we're not the ones that are providing that data, how are we going to derive knowledge from it? You could take the best artificial intelligence machine learning approach, but if the underlying data isn't representing what we do, it's going to be a problem. So I would make the case that DPT programs, and I'm going to also talk about how PhD programs should really include some aspect of clinical informatics or data informatics as a topic. One of the things that I've been heavily involved with, I built the learning health system for the 22 Shriners hospitals. And the one thing that resonates, as well as here within the UTMB health system, will be, and I think Nik, even within PedsNet, and he's going to talk about the PCORI networks, is simply people need to know how to write queryable queries. And so that we within our programs, if we have an idea of what standardized and common data models are, if we can start using ICD-9 and 10 codes, if we can start understanding what CPT-4 procedure codes are, and to really at least get a little bit closer to what that informatician understands, who often doesn't know a thing about PT or medical. I think we within our profession, within programs, need to do a better job of putting some clinical informatics skill sets forward within practice. All right, Nik, next one. And so again, sorry, I'm talking ahead of my slides. Familiarity with standardized vocabs. I thought maybe I left it out. Common data models, reframing the clinical question as an information request. All right, next slide. And at the program level, I've made some recommendations about teaching, documentation in clinical practice that all can be repurposed, use flow sheets, discrete data elements. Become involved in the design of PT documentation and EHR. Talk to your healthcare system about why that's a value added for them and what the interface should look like. And then again, as I mentioned, the clinical informatics pieces and data management and resources. These should all really start to be addressed at the program level. All right, Nik. There you go. So I'm going to turn it over to Nik.
All right. Well, thank you, Carole. And so I just want to say I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you all today and discuss kind of what the work that PCORI is funding and in the learning health system space and infrastructure space. So my name is Nik Koscielniak. I'm a program officer in research infrastructure at the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, or PCORI. And so most of my job really entails managing the infrastructure awards for PCORNet, clinical research networks, and the coordinating center for PCORNet. And so to start, I'm really just going to put on my researcher hat or put on my researcher philosopher hat, I guess, and take off my PCORI hat for a moment and briefly center us a little bit on what infrastructure is for a learning health system. When we think of infrastructure, we generally think of roads, bridges, railroads, sewer systems, electric grids. Often these infrastructures really fail fall into the background of society, and so they become embedded, and they also become so invisible to us that we really forget that they even exist. And so, except we do see them when there are clear problems like bridges collapse and roads need to be repaired, or sewer backs up, or even the power goes out in our house. And so what we often forget is that infrastructure is relational, and that one or topical, and that one person's infrastructure is sometimes another person's work. Or daily work, right? And so we also forget that what the purpose of infrastructure really is, and when infrastructure actually occurs, which to the late scholar Susan Lee Starr was to really resolve the tensions between local and global scales. And so the global being the more macro or meso levels, or what Edwards et al. Here refers to as glocal. And so the figure here describes definitions of infrastructure and what it really does, and kind of puts them on these coordinates. So when thinking of infrastructure for research, oftentimes we have to build out new infrastructure for each study that we conduct in learning health system science and a learning health system, and they are different. Building out an infrastructure that really supports multiple types of research and learning is really important to fully realize the potential of the model and to reduce research costs. And so the figure depicted here demonstrates this flywheel approach that a learning health system infrastructure should really be capable of supporting, such as faster, simpler cycles, or large, slower and more complex cycles. Another concept that this really shows the scalability that the infrastructure can support. Questions at smaller scales versus larger scales, more national level scales, all being supported by a learning health system infrastructure composed of people, processes, policies, and technology. So for example, infrastructure for a national learning health system must be able to resolve tensions between the individual health systems through a macro level approach, which is difficult but not impossible. And so putting my PCORI hat back on, I'm going to discuss PCORNet and the National Patient-Centered Clinical Research Infrastructure, and really the infrastructure to facilitate learning health systems. So throughout this talk, I'm going to address 4 key questions. Why did PCORI invest in the PCORNet infrastructure? What is it? How does the PCORNet infrastructure support a learning health system? And how will the PCORNet infrastructure evolve? So a little bit of background on PCORI. For those of you not familiar with PCORI, it was authorized by Congress through the ACA in 2010 as an independent nonprofit organization. And it was actually recently reauthorized in 2010 for 10 more years. So 10 more years of PCORI, and hopefully more after that. So PCORI really occupies a unique space in health research as we fund patient-centered clinical effectiveness or comparative clinical effectiveness research, really help patients, clinicians, and the broader healthcare community make better informed health decisions. And so PCORI has been a funder of infrastructure to support large-scale CER that really puts the patient at the center of research. And as time has gone on, some of the infrastructure may substantially support learning health system endeavors. Now, additionally, our congressional reauthorization requires us to identify national priorities and establish a research agenda outlining how we will address these priorities. So PCORI have identified 5 national priorities, and we have framed these new draft national priorities as long-term goals for health, with one specifically focused on accelerating progress towards the learning health system, and another explicitly calling out the role of building out infrastructure for patient-centered outcomes research. And so the 3 other national priorities provide essential opportunities to accelerate learning and research to progress towards for progress towards a learning health system. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about PCORNet. So as the landscape of research and health priorities has really evolved, existing scalable research infrastructure really may be used and enhanced to address PCORI's national priorities. And so in 2013, PCORI Board of Governors approved infrastructure funding for an initial group of partner networks, which became PCORNet. And they did this to expand the capacity to conduct patient-centered CER in a faster, relevant, and more efficient manner, really by leveraging the power of health data, reusable research infrastructure, and unique patient partnerships that is nationally representative to support a wide range of research or research activities. So PCORNet really follows a distributed research model, distributed research network model, which uses standardized data and multiple health systems and data marts, whereby data holders actually maintain physical control, use, and transfer of their data. And so all of the data remain behind firewalls at the health systems institutions, and the network data sharing agreements actually allow for sites to really share their data. So I'll just move on to the next slide. There we go. All right, so PCORNet is a network of networks. It really links the clinical research networks, patient partners, and coordinating center to build an engaged infrastructure that can connect people, health systems, and data to make informed decisions together. And so these decisions are driven and supported by the intersection of data, research, and engagement. So by harnessing the power of partnerships between many different health systems and health system leaders, we really see there's this tight connection between these stakeholders that's capable of building trust and accelerating knowledge about care delivery and implementing it into practice. So the ultimate goal of all of this really being to improve patient and population health. So the PCORNet common data model is important infrastructure for PCORNet. So data systems and data sources are leveraged by PCORNet network partners as PCORNet harmonizes and standardizes data from multiple institutions using the PCORNet common data model, or CDM. So this CDM continues to evolve through a collaborative process with the participating PCORNet network partners. The data elements in the PCORNet CDM include those shown in this figure. The ones in green are research ready, and the ones in blue can be research ready with additional work by CRNs to become usable for research. The other nice thing about the PCORNet CDM is that it has a core set of data elements that span a wide scope of diseases and conditions, thus making it, for the most part, disease agnostic, but also the flexibility, or has the flexibility to really respond to a variety of clinical research needs in the future, such as something like COVID. As the PCORI CDM continues to be built out on a project by project basis, it's built based on specific conditions and research needs. So what do I mean when I say PCORI and its clinical research networks? PCORI really leverages these data efficiently through a distributed nature, through the distributed nature of the CRNs across the nation. And so currently there are 8 PCORI CRNs that can help researchers conduct research more efficiently. Research can actually access data from everyday medical encounters from more than 60 million people in the US. Not physically access those data necessarily, but at least have the ability to to conduct a prep to research query that aggregates those data from a number of sites across the network. So this really does demonstrate the scale of PCORI infrastructure. So while this map displays the location of the data contributing sites and actually the prime site for each CRN, this slide actually shows the density and diversity of settings, geography, and scale of PCORI CRNs and their available data. And so the demographics of the patient population are broadly representative of the US population, and the settings of care include community hospitals, FQHCs, and primary care practices not commonly involved in clinical trials. Data also include EHR data from both ambulatory and inpatient care in the delivery system. And also includes claims data, or claims information, or other records representing care outside of the delivery system. So a key distinction between PCORI and other existing data networks is really its linkage to patients, providers, and health systems. When compared to other networks, PCORI is more than just about the data. And this really builds trust between stakeholders when it's not just about the data, but about the partnerships and the ability to build that trust. As much of the research that is really conducted using PCORI should have an engagement component with stakeholders that focuses on including patient representatives in the research process. And so PCORI involves and connects patients, clinicians, and other stakeholders to identify relevant research study topics. The PCORI front door actually serves as the main access point for researchers and all their stakeholders to support a variety of functions. The PCORI front door team actually interacts with many different types of requesters that are interested in leveraging PCORI resources for clinical trial operations. An intake team actually educates requesters, advises on how to use PCORI data resources, and connects them with people across the network, as well as people outside of the network interested in collaborating with the network. And so the front door team also supports not only the prep to research work, but also throughout the research process as needed. And I've also included a link here. So if you want to go to pcornet.org, you can follow you can read more about the front door and the different types of sites and networks that are funded through the PCORI initiative. And so one question many of you may actually be asking yourselves really is whether or not PCORI is actually an appropriate network for your research. PCORI can be a one-stop shop for the prep to research and feasibility queries to determine the appropriateness of the network to support your research. And so data across PCORI undergo a two-stage data curation process, which includes both the foundational and the study-specific processes to ensure that the data are, quote, fit for purpose and for a given study or analysis. Foundational curation occurs quarterly with every quarterly data refresh. And then so that way people have access to data they know are going to be research ready and for their type of study. And so the query process is really performed locally. And as I mentioned before, data remain at institutions behind their firewalls to maintain security. Now, the exact process for making a request for aggregate level data for a prep to research query is outlined in this figure shown here. And so the requester really goes to PCORnet.org, fills out an intake form detailing the request. The front door team then reviews that request, consults with the requester, and then submits that request to the query fulfillment team of the coordinating center. And then the coordinating center or the query fulfillment team then actually writes the query, distributes the query to the CRN sites, and then the sites respond to the query, submit aggregate data back to the query fulfillment center if they have data for that request. And then the query fulfillment center and the other coordinating center teams then send that back to, or collate the responses and sends that back to the requester. All right, so who really visits the front door? Requesters are frequently academic investigators, but also include funders representing federal foundation and industry partners. Most front door visitors are presenting for consultation and support or to really understand how to leverage PCORnet resources to enhance their research. And so in some instances, the front door team supports development of proposals in terms of the use of data or PCORnet data from a capability standpoint. So how can people actually use PCORnet data resources? They also may support with people to investigators to think about how to properly budget for a project that utilizes PCORnet partners and resources. Now, you don't have to have a PCORI award to use PCORnet resources for your research. Rather, actually, federal and industry partner funding helps really offset costs associated with maintaining the network infrastructure, despite the fact that that PCORI is the primary funder of PCORnet infrastructure. So this last part is really just discussing the PCORnet evolution. And so PCORnet infrastructure continues to really evolve to meet the needs of a changing research landscape. It does so in a way that really continues to use pragmatic and realistic trial designs that really focus on closing the time gap between research and relevance to care delivery decision makers. PCORI has awarded infrastructure development funds in a phased approach since 2013. Phase 1 actually focused on the design period for infrastructure development. Then phase 2 really focused on the infrastructure implementation, the capacity building and testing through demonstration projects. And then most recently, PCORI board approved infrastructure awards for phase 3, which kicked off last month. And actually transfers the focus from infrastructure building to actually infrastructure utilization. And so to really demonstrate this evolution, we can start back to 2016. At this point, it was really this was during phase 2. PCORI actually collaborated with the National Academy of Medicine to identify 5 research areas of high priority to health system leaders. Health system leaders actually came up with 5 priority research areas for utilizing PCORnet, described here. And PCORI funded 4 health system demonstration projects to actually show how PCORnet may be utilized for these priority areas. And so one of these, the PCORI funded PCORnet health system demonstration projects actually focused on predicting patients with preventable high utilization. And so the study was primarily conducted through the Insight CRN, which comprises hospitals around the New York City area. And while there have been several publications that resulted from this demonstration project, the study actually also received a 2020 PCORI funded COVID Enhancement Award to evolve the study to address health system questions related to hospital utilization during the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as developing subphenotypes of COVID. And so the PCORnet infrastructure has also supported the use of pragmatic and realistic trial designs to close the research and bedside time gap. PCORnet infrastructure has also supported researchers to rapidly embed clinical trial operations into routine clinical care during the pandemic. And so PCORI and PCORnet is actually well suited to provide a meaningful contribution to the evolving needs of the COVID-19 pandemic through its enhancement funding awards and the PCORnet research infrastructure to connect network collaborators. The icons here actually show how PCORNet is being tapped by industry and government to address real-world issues of national importance. This includes the CDC-funded COVID-19 CDM, which is actually a narrow PCORNet CDM for COVID surveillance, which is refreshed every 2 weeks. And then the NIH and FDA are also collaborating on trials and evidence generation research activities. And so in January 2021, PCORI Board of Governors actually approved 8 prioritizing principles for infrastructure funding related to PCORNet, and all of them are here. There's 8 here, and these really build on the defining characteristics and core principles to guide future PCORNet infrastructure funding for PCORNet, and that really aligns with PCORI's strategic research priorities. And so these principles help PCORI and PCORNet governance determine priorities for evolving the infrastructure. And while I won't go into any real depth in these are all really essential pieces to building a reusable, scalable, and evolving infrastructure for patient-centered and LHS research. And so PCORI recognizes the evolving PCORNet infrastructure, and this role may actually play in supporting LHS goals. And so many of the current areas of alignment between LHS concepts and PCORNet will be accelerated in this phase 3 to advance PCORI's national priorities around LHS and infrastructure. And so these are actually manifest in the PCORNet prioritizing principles, and a couple of them are identified here. And then additionally, PCORI is conducting a series of data convenings to develop strategic opportunities to enhance the PCORNet CDM in areas such as social determinants of health, patient-reported outcomes, and patient-generated health data, as well as CMS data access. And so we actually recently had 2 webinars that we held. One of them was on social determinants of health that we held in November, and there's a link here if folks are interested in accessing that. And then we also had a patient-reported outcomes one and patient-generated health data convening that occurred in December, as well as a accessible link there. And then lastly, funding opportunities. Recently, we put out a call for proposals to participate in health systems implementation initiatives, and this really aims to expand PCORI's efforts to promote the implementation of evidence from PCORI-funded research in real-world practice settings. And so the information related to this is on our website at PCORI.org, and then we have an informational town hall coming up next week. So if anyone is interested in that, feel free to attend that. And then we also have 2 priority areas: individuals with or maternal morbidity, mortality, which we don't have a current funding opportunity for at the moment, but we do have a current funding opportunity for individuals with IDD, or intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so we're interested in applications related to CER work targeting mental health in individuals with IDD. And so that is that. Happy to take any questions.
Yeah, I just want to thank you, Nik. How many people, and it's hard to see hands, are familiar or have used PCORNet or one of the PCORNet networks? So I'm going to briefly come back again, because I can't, it's late. We're not putting hands up. It's one too many margaritas on 22222. But
maybe if you stop sharing the screen, you'll be able to see people.
Oh, there you go. Good idea. Thank you, Deb. For those that haven't, and this kind of goes back to this concept of me within a physical therapy department thinking I'd really like to look at all the patients in the hospital that have had physical therapy that also have cerebral palsy and an orthotic. I mean, pick again any clinical thing that you're interested in. At my hospital, maybe I have 1,000 of them. If I can frame what I'm looking at in that common data model or work with the PCORNet front door, I still call it a portal, it gets larger. So within PedsNet, I do pediatric PT, which is the pediatric PCORNet site. I go from having maybe 1,000 kids with CP to 70,000 kids to over 1 million that have been seen for a period of time. And what What PedsNet does is, again, based on priorities, extract elements from all of those data records and de-identify them. So I could easily ask a question about those kids with CP. I could ask about the number of infections, the length of stay, what medications are they on. Wow, but then when I get down into what was their range of motion, what was their gross motor function classification scale, or how many hours of PT they have, or what did they, this comes back to where if we as physical therapists are not documenting that starting now, if we haven't already, these clinical research data networks are going to reflect more medical data or things that may be of interest to people that are even more heavily designed. And Nik has talked to us about how they're looking to expand and make these networks better. And it's a real call to action for us as PTs and OTs to look and engage with the front door to understand what the data is. And even at the micro level, for any of us that still practice or teach practitioners, start documenting, work with your EHR folks to have forms that we could then get that knowledge back on. Go to PCORI, go to those front doors, look at their data model. It's intriguing to look at, but in PedsNet, I think, Nik, they have like over 100 million kids across the United States with EHR data all extracted based on that common data model. That could be really powerful. So that's all I want to say. I'm trying to kind of tie it back to the infrastructure, the big thing, and our need to engage with these big clinical research networks that we all now have access to. So, okay, sorry, that's a little bit of my end of the philosophy in this. I'm afraid we're going to get left behind if we don't update our how we document, and if we don't advocate for the elements that matter to us to be included at the granular level we need in these data networks. So sorry. All right, questions. I had if Nik talk really fast because I wanted him to get all the PCORI information in so that we would have time for questions. So don't be shy. All right, so let's do some.
So
Okay,
I'll
go
ask-
ahead.
well, here's one that's already, yeah, somebody's starting, and kind of, I had a starting question too.
Yeah.
Is there a cost that to query these data sets? Do you have to start out with a grant, a small grant or something to go to approach PCORI with a query?
So that's a great question. So the concept of these networks is really about being able to facilitate large clinical trials or multi-site, multi-CRN trials. And so oftentimes, you can go the data science route with saying, this is my research question. I want to be able to pull data from all these places. And so you work with the front door to initially say, well, I'm interested in, so from a prep to research standpoint, I'm interested in, I'm going to be submitting an application for X or writing a proposal for X. And so the idea really is to support the investigator in identifying whether or not PCORNet resources are appropriate for your research. It's not to basically just be a big data set that you can go and write your own query and all of that. That's not really what the purpose of PCORNet is for. It's infrastructure to support people to be able to do research at scale and answer questions of national importance, or and also develop utilize it for definitive evidence from research studies. And so being able to have that connection to 70-something health systems and their satellites and whatnot, is really great, but it's not meant to go in and ask a question so that you can run a bunch of data science, machine learning stuff on. Now, can you do that? Yes, but in the context of a study, you won't be able to access any of those data until your grant has been accepted. So the whole idea is you go to the front door, knock on the front door, you do a prep to research thing, whether or not it's appropriate for your study, you get aggregate data back, and then you then proceed with writing your proposal. And so that's kind of the process.
Yeah, but I know that we really focused and are talking about PCORI, but in answer to that question, if that's still intimidating, for those of you that use Epic, there's a slicer dicer application. You can do all your prep to research on your Epic data records with slicer dicer, and there's some nice documentation that will let you do slicer dicer. And I hate that name. I think it's weird, but it allows you to do that prep for research. There's also TriNetX, which has, it's a big system of data. And again, how would I want to get started to do any of these? I'd want to start to understand, thinking about not my clinical documentation at an individual level, but the concept of these common data models, and kind of thinking about the logic of defining a patient cohort. I need kids that are this age that don't have this or don't have that, and then try to get it refined a little bit. But I think just playing with the slicer dicer or going to TriNetX, or there's some other sites, and my email is up there. You could feel free to pop me an email if you want to do that.
And if anyone is a part of, so another similar, and I had a figure up there related to all of the other types of networks, or not all, but one of them was ACT. So that's the one that's funded by NCATS. So if you're a part of if you have a CTSI at your institution, you can actually access data through through ACT. And then also, if you're only focused on local data, you can access, if your system has access to or stores their data in an I2B2, you can access, you can write you can do a point and click query or self-service tool with I2B2 at your institution.
I2B2 is a common data model.
Yeah, I know we have that here at UNC, and that was kind of what I was thinking about, is like, do you start with this little baby query and then you think, oh, I might have a potential thing, but I
think, yeah, Deb, I would probably start to think about doing that query defining your cohort, because that's a good way. That's the hardest part for people to figure out, and then maybe to think about the variables you want. But Neva, you've had your hand up for a little while.
Yeah. So, and I think this goes along well with what you were just describing, Carole. I know that I've had some frustration with collaborating with people who have fairly large repositories. I've had some experience with the Alzheimer's disease research centers, and it becomes very frustrating when, if you're not there to build those repositories at the beginning, when they don't have the kind of functional outcome data that we might be really interested in. So I'm wondering, in these common data models, what's an example of the kind of critical functional outcomes might be queryable in the PCORI data as an example?
Yeah, it's going to vary a little bit, and so I'm going to address this first, at least, and then Nik will probably say something more cognitively stimulating. I worked in parallel with PedsNet, which was the PCORI one, as I established the Shriners one. And as I went back and forth with the PI on PedsNet, who I have a lot of respect for, I was like, are you putting assistive devices in what you're pulling out now? And this was in the early days. And as Nik said, they're expanding, they're looking to expand. I think this is where we need to be involved. And they said, no, we're actually not putting that in. And I said, well, are you going to be putting in any of the data in the PT section, like range of motion and manual muscle test? Well, no, not yet. We may build that out. And so, Neva, I think you hit the nail on the head, is really understanding about that. Now, these have evolved in time where some of that data may be in there, but I think this is where we, again, as a profession, and when I think back at RIPPT and where can we advocate, I think part of it is really having a stronger voice about what's embedded in these data networks, or building a rehab research relevant common data element set that we would like to have extracted. So there's variance in there.
And it makes me think about how some of the work that, for example, we've done with NeuroEdge in particular, where we've identified the 6 key outcomes that we're caring about. If it seems like we need to kind of marry that with this idea of health informatics and large data sets.
Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah, and I will also add to what Carole said, related to the work that we are currently doing around our data convenings, in terms of being able to expand or enhance the data infrastructure for PCORNet, or the PCORNet data infrastructure. And so the areas of social determinants of health and patient-reported outcomes and patient-generated health data, those are areas that we see opportunities for, but we also need to figure out what those opportunities really are, and where can we think about, standards that are necessary to, at what point are people actually answering, asking questions that will leverage maybe secondary use of patient-reported outcomes, right? Those are really important to consider, but we want to make sure that that as we are considering the opportunities to build out the data infrastructure, that we do it that in ways that are, we're not just going to build infrastructure to build infrastructure. We need it. It has to be topical. It has to be relational. It has to be something that people are going to use. And so, if we just dump a bunch of patient-reported outcomes and create standards for it, and no one uses it, then we're funding the maintenance of that. And so that's another issue that we have to deal with, that if we build it, will people actually come? But it should also be built by, on a case-by-case basis. And that's an important concept around infrastructure, which is really, you build on existing infrastructure. You don't just build new infrastructure and then hope it links. And that's kind of why we're in this big mess in society related to interoperability, because we built out these systems in silos. So the importance of being able to build out infrastructure, data infrastructure on top of PCORNet data infrastructure is enhancing that infrastructure is super important.
I think I see some sort of things that you guys could maybe discuss in a common way. Like Sam is pointing out, you're making the point that in PT, we almost need to have an infrastructure for teaching this, whether it's to the learner who's at the DPT or at the graduate level. So, but you might be at a program that, and even here at where I am, we have trouble getting what we need in the electronic medical record, right? And so how do we practice and gain confidence in dealing with this area, if we don't have access to it, or we need to get more confidence and access to it so that we can better advocate? So are there tools out there or mechanisms that we can grow as professionals so that we become better advocates and we teach our students in a better way?
Yeah, Debbie, that's a super great question. And this is where perhaps informing those that are in the Learn network, that it's great to learn how to deal with the healthcare system and be a PT and that interaction. But I think that there's almost a more fundamental level that sometimes Learn hasn't yet captured, which is just that skill set. So for me, the way I learned, and I have to admit, I'm also an engineer that does a lot of software. I've always done big data, AI, and ML. But where I started getting re-engaged in this was better understanding the data model And so whether it's OMOP, I2B2, you can go to PCORI, they use a modified OMOP model, and looking at how they link data. PCORI and PedsNet, I'm more familiar with PedsNet because I'm pediatrics. They have some great resources on there about understanding the data model. If you go to the OMOP website, they also have some good information and tutorials on just starting to not think about electronic health record organization, but this common data model. So those are two places. The other hard thing that I have in teaching people is they'll say, I want to cohort and I want to exclude everybody that had surgery. And I said, I can't, as your informatician, exclude surgeries because they're in procedures. And so if you say exclude surgery, there's not a code for any type of surgery. They have osteotomies, you have cabbages, you have neurosurgery. They're all unique codes. So think about what you want to include. So I guess, where would I go? So I think this will be a topic at CSM next year, both as a pre-con and probably within an ed session. So I would encourage to start there. I have a fair amount of resources because I've been teaching this as a clinical informatics certificate level grad program. And that could be another one. How many of you guys use Epic? How many of you have tried Slicer Dicer? So you know that you have Slicer. So if you have an Epic-based medical record, you can Google Epic Slicer Dicer. There's some nice tutorials and they start talking to you about how do you start doing that logical anding and oring and excluding populations and looking at time and what are the graphics. And so if you have an Epic-based EMR, I would probably try that as a tool. How many people use Cerner or I2B2, if you know what that is, could be another one, but this is a struggle. What else do other people use?
Carole, you may need to start typing some of your acronyms.
You know what? I will tell you what I am doing. I am putting all of this in the chat. I've been typing in the chat, and do you know what? I've been sending them directly to Jamil, who is organizing. He's our background tech person, because that's who I started with. So
yeah, they're not coming to everyone.
Right. No. Oh my God. I've been sitting here like, this is a great idea. So Jamil, is there a way that you can take my message
Copy and paste her stuff
and share them?
Because I'm like, I2B2, I'm like struggling to keep up with all your acronyms.
Oh, this is hysterical. Yeah.
We do.
Yeah, I've been direct messaging Jamil all of my information to all of you guys.
Okay, well, you've had a great dialogue with Jamil. He's probably wondering why you're talking to him.
Yeah, he finally said, you know, you're just sending these to me. And I'm like, apparently not. And I haven't had my margarita yet. I did also put my email in the chat for Jamil, and Nix and I were on the last slide. Please just email me, because what I can do is start to take everything I put in the chat kind of as a primer to get engaged, and I can email it out to all of you guys. I'm so sorry. Here I thought I was being so smart.
That's why I was like, let's stop. And we're going to need to wrap this up because we're 5 minutes, 8:35. But it really has been a stimulating discussion and presentation. And we certainly need to, I think from my perspective, we need this, we really do need this, but the physicians and surgeons and other people get so much more attention, and getting our stuff into the record the way we need it has been a relatively frustrating experience, at least in our system, but it is getting better.
Yeah, and Debbie, you're right. We hardly teach advocacy, and we do it all in the political sense, but this is a real chance for us to be advocates within our healthcare system. Mm-hmm. And to really, because this is how we're going to prove that physical therapy is effective in the end, and improve our practice, and we can't be left behind with it.
Right. And I think that's where, when I've gone to I2B2, you can get patient demographics and stuff like that, but you can't get anything that's really, other things that are really meaningful. It's getting better, but not much. But anyways, everybody, thank you all for coming. And as I said, in about almost exactly a month, we're going to go into our first wearable sensor, and then March, and then in April, a second wearable sensor. So please come back and see those speakers again. And thank you so much, Carole and Nik, for an exciting talk. And you can, if you didn't get it tonight, come back for the recording in about a week. We usually get them back up in about 2 weeks. So
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you.